My name is James Braye, and I am the Director of Forensics at Florida State University. And what that entails is I'm the debate coach. A very interesting job, which leads me into all kinds of avenues and treks, meeting people, and invitations of this nature. And I thank those responsible for this invitation tonight, and I thank you all for coming. This is going to prove to be a very interesting evening, the benefits of which will be very intellectual, and for certain organizations locally, financially, very pleasing given the turnout tonight. A couple of announcements, very basic logistical announcements concerning the format. The resolution at hand tonight is resolved that the theory of evolution is superior to the theory of special creation as an explanation for the scientific evidence related to origins. Simply stated, evolution versus special creation. The format will be as follows. Speaking in support of the resolution will be Dr. Larry Abele, who will speak for 1 hour, or approximately 1 hour. Speaking for the negative will be Dr. Gish, also speaking for approximately an hour. After this 2-hour session, or parts thereof, there will be a 10-minute break. I'd ask you to do a couple of things during that break. Stretch, relax. There are bathrooms down these 2 corridors at the point, and also there are bathrooms downstairs. Also during that break, if you would write down questions that you might have for the participants and turn those questions into various individuals who will be circulating. Those questions then will be gone through and they will be divided up equally, and that is the format for handling the questions for this evening. After the break, we'll return, and the first affirmative rebuttalist will have 15 minutes to respond to the overall picture that has been displayed. The first negative rebuttalist will then follow, also with 15 minutes, and then finally there will be summary statements and positions, the second negative rebuttal and the second affirmative rebuttal, totaling 5 minutes each. After the constructives and rebuttal speeches have been completed, there will be a 45-minute question and answer session. The format for that question and answer session will be very straightforward. I will go through the questions and I will divide them equally, and I will ask a question of the affirmative speaker, who then will have time to comment on the nature of that question. The negative speaker will respond, and then the affirmative will have one final response to the overall question. Then we will go to the second question, and it will go back and forth for the remainder of the evening. The format aside, let me introduce the 2 gentlemen for this evening. Speaking first is Dr. Larry Abele, Professor of Biology at the Florida State University, supporting the theory of evolution. On the negative is Dr. Gish, who has received his BS in chemistry from UCLA and a PhD in biochemistry from the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Gish has spent 18 years in biochemical research at Cornell University Medical College, the Virus Laboratory, University of Berkeley, California, and the Upjohn Company, a pharmaceutical corporation. For 18 years, he has served as Vice President for the Institute for Creation Research. I do believe we're ready to begin. Dr. Abele?
I'm very pleased to be here this evening, especially to make a contribution to a couple of worthy charities in town, Habitat for Humanity and the Leon County Food Bank. I'm also pleased to be here because I'm excited about science, and the science of biology in particular. And I hope to transmit that excitement to you and to review evidence as to why I believe organisms on Earth are related by common descent. I'm going to primarily speak from slides this evening. I don't want to show Dr. Gish's slides. Find this thing. The other end. That is Dr. Gish's slide. That would make for extremely interesting discussion. I'd like to begin by introducing to you the notion of common descent. And I would like to introduce you to some of my relatives. This happens to be my great-great-grandfather from Memphis, Tennessee, a builder. And this is my great-grandfather, another builder from Memphis, Tennessee. And this is my grandfather, born in Memphis. If you could turn the lights down just a little bit more. Born in Memphis, and I got to know him and spend quite a bit of time with him when I was in graduate school in Miami at the Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science. We got to spend a lot of time talking about different things.
Do you want to hold this when you walk away so they make sure they hear you?
Okay. Now we see if I can walk and talk at the same time. This is actually my grandfather just after he came back from the First World War. And this is my father after he came back from both the Second and the Korean War. Now, I have a very distant cousin that I would also like to introduce to you. And this distant cousin, I know what you're thinking. The resemblance is uncanny. They're both bald. Easy way to tell us apart is I'm about a foot taller than he is. What I mean by evolution and relationship by common descent, that at some time in the past, approximately 16 million years ago, about 16 million years ago, based on the available evidence, a group of ape-like organisms diverged and gave rise to two evolutionary lines. One line, over a long period of time, ended up giving rise to humans in addition to other organisms. The second line gave rise to my distant cousin, the orangutan. Evolution, therefore, is relationship by common descent with modification. It's the simplest definition, and it's the definition used by the National Academy of Sciences. There are lots of different definitions of evolution that you might hear if you ask someone on the street. This is the scientific definition of evolution. By extension, all organisms on Earth are related, from sponges to worms to hedgehogs. And I will develop the argument based on the fossil record, comparative morphology, embryology, and molecular biology, that relationship by common descent with modification is a scientific explanation for life on Earth, and that there is a great deal of data supporting it. In fact, that's why it's called a theory of evolution, because a theory, in fact, just like the germ theory of disease, is an explanation that has withstood numerous tests over time and has found to be a valid explanation for the observed facts. Well, to trace my lineage actually is pretty easy. All I have to do is find the family Bible that my grandfather keeps, and he records all major events in our family in this book. And while we were in graduate school, or I was in graduate school, we spent a lot of time talking about these things. And he would have really enjoyed being here this evening. He enjoyed learning new things, approaching ideas with an open mind, and he enjoyed the spiritual strength that he gained from the Bible. He would have been a little disturbed that some people say it's either evolution or God, because that's not the case, and it never has been the case. He explained it this way, that eternal truths, spiritual truths, don't change. Therefore, the Bible can be a spiritual guide for all time. Science, on the other hand, by its very nature, discovers new facts. New technology is developed. It's constantly changing. He would turn to the Bible to answer the questions of why, and to science to answer the questions of how. And how science answers those questions is by applying these criteria. And these are the criteria that are applied to medicine, physics, mathematics, or astronomy. And it begins with a statement. And that is, it deals with the natural laws of the universe. Science cannot deal and does not deal with the supernatural in any way. It focuses on the natural laws of the universe. It's predictive and generates testable hypotheses. It makes statements that can be shown to be false. And many people believe that unless a statement can be shown to be false, that it is not a scientific statement. Often experimental, lots of experiments can be done in evolution as well as in other sciences. and it's empirical. It's based on evidence, either directly or indirectly. The results should be reproducible by independent investigators, and I think that I'll convince you tonight that you can reproduce many of these things that I'm going to talk about yourself. There's no mystery about any of it. And finally, it is fallible. Science is always open to revision, and that's what makes it so exciting. New discoveries, new ideas, new challenges. The notion of evolution has two parts. Part one are the facts supporting relationship by common descent. And those facts are the results of research done over 100 years. And that research has convinced hundreds of thousands of biologists and other scientists around the world, as well as many, many religious leaders, that the theory of evolution is a valid explanation for the origin and development of life on Earth. The second part of the hypotheses concerning evolution. What is the relative effect of genetic drift? What's the relative effect of selection pressure or mutations? Those are very different questions. They're exciting questions, they're hotly debated questions, and they form the focus of research for a lot of people. I'm going to review a number of topics relating to relationship by common descent. We're going to take a look at comparative anatomy, embryology, fossils, and a fossil, remember, is any trace, remnant, or the organism itself from a different geologic past, generally something 10,000 years or older. We're going to talk about stratigraphy, and that is the study of the sequence, age, and structure of sedimentary rock. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about origin of structures. I'm going to make a falsifiable statement, a statement that can be tested. I'm going to begin by saying we're going to test the statement that fossils in rocks are randomly distributed versus fossils in rocks follow a sequence. It's a very straightforward test of a hypothesis. And we can begin as an introduction to the fossil record and sediments by taking a look at a picture of the Grand Canyon. The easiest way to understand the notion of the accumulation of sediments, and what you can see here if you look, is that there appear to be layers. And I don't think there's any disagreement that these layers are the results of sediments settling down out of water. You could, an analogy might be you come in from outside, you're working hard, and you take a bath. And you're in a hurry, you get out of the bathtub without cleaning it up. And you notice there's a ring around it. And that ring around it is similar to sediments, water going up and down in the bathtub that leaves that ring. And if you didn't clean it for a while, and a number of you took baths in there, and if it was a shallow tub, pretty soon you would have a layer of sediments, just like these layer of sediments that you see here. You might even have a tick or something on you that could get caught in those sediments, and if you waited long enough, it might even fossilize. Now, we don't really have to go to the Grand Canyon to take a look at this. And I suggest we just go out to the Ochlockonee River, out by Talquin Dam, and let's take a look at the sediments out there. Here's the Ochlockonee River, and we notice here that there are clear layers of different kinds of dirt or sand along there, sediments. And sedimentary rocks are the results of weathering of rocks, breaking it up into small particles, and then reforming it in rocks again. Now, we can take a close look at this. In fact, you could do it yourself. I know that some Boy Scout troops have a little project that they do there. You could take a PVC pipe, a couple inches around, and just pound it in the ground at the top here. And then if you pulled that out, what you would see, you'd lay the pipe out, cut off the top, and cut it in half, and you would see that in some areas it's all black clay. In other areas it's black clay in one part, a gray clay, and then sort of a different color here. All of these are sediments indicating that the water in that area rose and fell over time. And then here in the Jackson Bluff, Leon County, Florida, Ochlockonee River, you could plot out these different sort of sand layers. And they don't just have different sand layers, they have organisms in them. This is a fossil scallop. And because there's a fossil scallop there, the suggestion is that these were shallow water marine habitats, just like you could collect scallops off St. Mark's or St. Joe Bay. I would be a little careful, though, in that region because this is a shark's tooth about 6 inches long that was taken in the same area. Fortunately, nothing that large exists today. In other areas of Leon County, you can collect mastodon bones that are anywhere from 10,000 and greater years old. If you go to South Florida, you can find giant ground sloths that are no longer in existence today. By looking at the sequence of these fossils in the record, a number of people in England, beginning in the late 1790s up to about 1810, developed a naming system. And this is for instance, the rock strata under the state of Kansas. And this is from an oil company map. This isn't from evolutionary biologists or someone with a stake in the game. And each of these has a different name. And they were named because in the 1790s and 1800s, there was no way to estimate the age of these formations. And so the names referred to events. For instance, there were certain fossils characteristic of the Permian. And it's called the Permian because it was described first from eastern Russia in Perm, so Permian. Just like Cambrian here was described after some fossils in Wales near Cambria. So these layers of rocks with their fossils were given names. And when people wanted to make comparisons across Europe, what they did was look at the kinds of sediments that are there and the kinds of fossils that are in them. This, from the Cambrian up, was called the Phanerozoic, meaning visible life. And they referred to that because at that time, it was thought that below the Cambrian there was no life. There were a lot of rocks that appeared to be pretty old that were not well understood. And these are called stromatolites or stony carpets. And they're called that because of these, they look like little pieces of carpet that are made of stone. If you took, as has been done since about 1955 or 1960 as technology became available, and took a slice through there, you would see that there's a definite structure to it. And that suggests that it was laid down by living organisms. Well, that's a hypothesis that might be tested and might not. However, in about the middle 50s, this particular site called Shark Bay, Australia was discovered. And in this region, which is a shallow water marine sea, there's something unusual about it. If you look closely, if you've ever been down to the Florida Keys, you'll notice that what's unusual about this site is there's no fish in it. There's no snails, there's no corals. All you see is these round things that look exactly like stromatolites that were known only as fossils. What these are living blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. And the reason that they have formed these exact replicas is that these areas are hypersaline. There's a lot of evaporation. Organisms can't live there, and they don't break down the material. So in an undisturbed environment, these blue-green algae grow in the same form that they have, it will turn out, for millions and millions of years. Using the electron microscope and diamond saws, cutting through rocks deeper and deeper in the strata, what you see are some things like this. Now, I don't know what that looks like to you, but it doesn't look like much to me. However, if you take a whole survey of these, you see a whole series of things. You see some round cells here, and you see some cells that look like this. In fact, you see what even looks like the center of a cell or the nucleus with organelles all around. And then you see things that look very much like complex cells today. So we see very primitive cells, and all these primitive cells are bacteria and their relatives. And then we see advanced cells, which are called eukaryotes or complex cells. The sequence, though, around the world doesn't change. We never find, for example, mammals showing up deep in rocks with jawed fishes or jawless fishes. What happens deep in rocks is we see these primitive fish without jaws, then we see jawed fishes, then amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. The same is true of plants. This is a fossil fern. This is some leaves from a tree. These belong to the angiosperms or flowering plants. And we see the same sequence. There are ferns, deep in rocks, and flowering plants much, much more shallow in rocks, and then these things, seaweeds and their relatives, go all the way down to the very deepest rocks. And if we sort of summarize from all the results around the world, we see that in the deepest rocks we find these prokaryote bacterial cells, then complex cells, then vertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, all the way up into modern humans. The important thing to remember here is that most of this was worked out long before Charles Darwin ever published his theory of evolution. In fact, very little was known about it. I think if you look in The Origin of Species, a relatively small amount of information was space was devoted to this question, because all they knew is that those sequences were there. There was no way to estimate the age of those rocks. I think that we can say that there is a sequence to fossils in rocks. And what's important is that you can verify this yourself. Take a drive out to the Ochlockonee or down to the Apalachicola and look through those formations and see the change that occurs going from some marine organisms and in other areas terrestrial organisms. Now, if I said that there's modification through common descent, that suggests that it takes a long time to achieve this. And I'm going to present data that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Not only has there been sufficient time for evolution, I'm going to tell you how the energy for that evolution came about. Beginning in about 1900, physicists began to understand radioactivity and radioisotopes. They realized that some radioactive elements decay spontaneously into what were called daughter elements, and that these elements decay at a spontaneous rate that doesn't change. It doesn't change with temperature, pressure, or any other conditions. Now, there are a lot of intricacies of radioactive dating. The important thing is that it can again be verified in the laboratory by anyone who bothers to take the time. For example, if we started out with rubidium-87, in 47 billion years, half of it would have decayed into strontium. So here's rubidium. We say we start out with 10 grams there. Over 47 billion years, there'll be rubidium there and strontium-87. We can say the same thing. Potassium goes to argon in a shorter period of time. The half-life is 1,300,000 years. Now, obviously, you're not going to find 50-50 of any of this, but you're going to find different ratios. And there are several different independent checks on these. For example, you can look at the different isotopes of strontium and compare those ratios. You can look at the formation of different minerals in the same rocks and check ages that way. You can also look at rocks that require crystals in minerals that require potassium. If the rock spontaneously decays, we should find, say if it started out with 8 potassium atoms, and you can verify this through molecular analysis, you would end up in 1.3 billion years with 4 argon atoms and 4 potassium atoms. And these are just a few of the more common elements that are used. You can see that of all the age dating methods, and I'm going to show you a slide how many there are, 60% use rubidium, strontium, and potassium argon. Lead, uranium lead, is not used that much anymore, although it still is. And the problem, there are intermediate steps between uranium and lead. There is what is called non-radiogenic lead and radiogenic lead. And it requires estimating parameters that you may not feel comfortable with. But as you can see, neither potassium or argon has intermediate stages. And we're not talking about 1 or 2 estimates of the age of the Earth. This is a plot of the number of publications along this axis and the date of those publications along this axis. Now, following the Second World War, a great deal was learned about atomic energy, obviously. As the technology became available, we see that in the 50s there were relatively few estimates of the age of the Earth. Then we see that as technology became available in 1960, 200 measurements, 200 and about 25 the next year, 225 after that, 300 in 1965, about 400 in 1970, for a total of thousands and thousands of independent measurements of the age of the Earth. And there is no reason to believe that there are any conspiracies going on about the age of the Earth. Too many people independently can verify these data themselves. What this allows us to do is now map age onto those fossil strata that we saw. And what we see when we do that is that the jawless fishes are about 500 million years they go back, whereas mammals only go back about 200 million years. Notice that the age of these rocks is independent of the fossils, and they were determined in an independent way. So we first have a set of data on the sequence of life in the rocks. Then we have a separate independent set of data on the age of those rocks. They are both consistent with the notion of relationship by common descent. If we plot all of the available information, we see that the earliest life is about 3.5 billion years old, and that happens to be that one cell that I showed you earlier. We see complex cells showing up about 1.4 billion years, then 600,000, et cetera, until modern humans about 50,000 years ago. Well, the process of evolution, or the process of change, requires energy. And let's just take a minute to talk about energy. And the energy on Earth, as most of you know, comes from the sun. A lot of energy comes from the sun. What we want to do is talk about the first and second laws of thermodynamics. In the first law, energy cannot be created or destroyed. So the total amount of energy in the universe is going to remain constant. However, energy can move around the universe as long as it doesn't increase or decrease. It can change state. It can go from mechanical energy to heat to different kinds of energy. The sun is losing huge amounts of energy to Earth, and Earth is gaining that energy. The total amount of energy has not changed. It just has been displaced from one to another. Now, the second law of thermodynamics says that there is a tendency for all systems, in the absence of anything to the contrary, to become disordered, entropy. And anybody can think about that for themselves. I mean, if you don't eat and take in energy for a while, you will disintegrate. You will break down. Your car will rust if you don't take care of it. However, life is a highly ordered process. So something must be going on. Otherwise, we all wouldn't be sitting here tonight. And that highly ordered process is driven by energy from the sun. 2 million trillion calories of energy from the sun hit Earth every second. That means that we can maintain a highly ordered state called life as long as there is a greater increase in entropy in another part of the solar system or universe. And frankly, I don't care where that is as long as we maintain our life here on Earth. That energy is transformed into a usable form by a number of different kinds of processes. There's chemical processes. You can have hydrogen sulfide bacteria. You can have blue-green bacteria that use a form of photosynthesis. And of course, the example that most of us are familiar with, simply plants transforming energy from the sun into usable energy for people like us, as well as animals. I would now like to turn to vertebrates and ask, is there any relationship among the various groups of vertebrates on Earth? We see fishes and amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And I'm going to suggest that there is a relationship among these organisms on Earth, and we can find that relationship in several different ways. We can simply compare their anatomy, we can look at the origin of structures, and we can look at a comparison of the same structure. Now, the vertebrates belong to a group called the chordates, and it contains a few other things. For instance, this certainly doesn't look like anything related to us, but it's a sea squirt. And if you go down to St. Joe Bay or out to Alligator Harbor and collect some of these, you can bring them back, put them in a tank, and they'll reproduce. And one of the striking things you see is that the eggs hatch and what looks exactly like a tadpole swims out, and it's called a tadpole larval stage. Well, if you took this tadpole larval stage and just cut through it, you would find that it has some characteristics. It has a dorsal nerve tube, has a notochord, and has these pharyngeal gill slits. Well, something like this is what biologists sometimes get criticized for, drawing diagrams that may not exist. Well, get a little plankton net or any kind of a net and go to the tip of Alligator Harbor or St. Joe Bay and drag it along the sand, bouncing it up and down. And what you'll see is this. There's pharyngeal gill slits, a dorsal hollow nerve cord, and a notochord supporting the body just beneath it. Not only that, they're represented in the fossil record more than 500 million years ago. Currently, those animals with bone, the vertebrates, consist of a few examples of jawless fishes. This is a lamprey eel, and it's feeding on a trout. If you take it off the trout, take a look there, it's looking at you too, it has a mouth here, and it has a set of teeth that are sort of distributed around. It doesn't have anything like a hinged jaw. Well, the first thing we're going to have to do is go from the jawless fishes to those with jaws. Notice here that it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 openings, and inside these openings are its gills with bars supporting those gills. And here we go with another diagram. It has the anterior tube moving forward to form jaws. Now, if you look at that, it's maybe hard to believe, but I suggest that if you go fishing off Dog Island and catch a kingfish, that the relationship between jaws and these bars supporting the gills are obvious, and you can show that same relationship by taking a look at the embryological development of these organisms. Clean a fish the next time, leave its head on and dissect away the jaws and the bars there, and it's clear that those anterior supports have moved forward. Well, fishes consist of two major groups. The fin-rayed fishes, like a largemouth bass and brim and things like that, and another group of fish called the lobed fin fishes. And they're called lobed fin fish because these anterior lobes here are very different. In fact, this is the coelacanth, which you may remember reading about. It was thought to have become extinct millions of years ago, and then some specimens showed up off the coast of Africa. In fact, there's a big controversy right now over whether or not people ought to be allowed to collect those organisms because they are in danger of extinction, it is argued. However, if we take a look at the fossils, we can look at that forelimb, and this is this anterior limb here, just like your arm. And we can see that it has a series of bones there, and if you trace them out, you see there's a finned rayed fish, a lobed fin fish, and then there's an amphibian. And this is traced back to this particular fossil amphibian. Clearly, the forelimbs of lobed fin fishes are not that dissimilar from amphibians, and in fact are more similar to amphibians than they are to their fish relatives. Well, I just have to show you Archaeopteryx. Everybody loves Archaeopteryx. There are perhaps 5 fossils known in the world. And last year, an entire symposium was devoted to these 5 fossils. Whether or not they're real, whether or not it's a bird, whether or not it's a reptile, I'll let you decide for yourself. Now, if we classify birds, we say that birds have feathers and a fused clavicle or collarbone. And this has feathers that you can probably make out here, and you can't see it, but it does have that fusion. We take a look at the appendages. One of these is a reptile, one of these is a bird, and one of these is Archaeopteryx. While it may have characteristics of birds, it clearly has characteristics of reptiles. Similarly, I think you can draw the same comparison from looking at these. The best explanation for the similarity in bones of these is modification with descent. There's no reason to expect a priori that a bat should have this sort of structure, a bird this sort of structure, a horse, a dog, or a man. It's certainly not related to function. One of the things I told you is that you can verify a lot of this for yourself. And I'm not recommending that you stop and pick up roadkills, but There's certainly a lot of possums out there on the road. And if you take a look at a possum and you take a look at its lower jaw here, you see that it's one single bone called the dentary, and it has a sort of a lip that comes up and fits into sort of a ball and socket joint in the back here. If we take a look at a reptile, we see that the dentary actually ends right here. There's the bone, and then it goes on back, and the connection between the back of the jaw and the skull is very different. One fits with the squamosal bone and one fits with the quadrate. Very different jaw structures. Now there's a group of reptiles called theriodonts that are abundant in the fossil record, occurring over a few million-year period. Now, a lot of people have a slide like this. In fact, the book that I started checking these information on has all these hypothetical forms in it. But what I've done is removed all the hypothetical forms and only included those representatives that have an actual fossil specimen associated with them. These are not arranged in any order. There's some that have this long dentary bone, and some have this huge fin on the top, some have a short dentary bone, but there are a lot of transitions there between the jaws of mammals and the jaws of reptiles. We can also take a look at the inner ear of amphibians, mammal-like reptiles, and reptiles. Now, this is the dentary, this is the angular, the articular, and the quadrate. And there's the stapes, a single bone, most reptiles, amphibians, and birds in the inner ear. Just take a minute and reach back and feel your lower jaw. And if you move it around, you'll feel your ear move. And that's because there's this intimate relationship that exists between your lower jaw and your ear. As you take a look, these mammal-like reptiles, these theriodonts and others, the quadrate and the articular have become very small and end up as the incus or anvil and malleus or hammer of the inner ear. You can verify this for yourself. Remember, marsupials, like possums, the young leave the reproductive tract very, very early in development, almost in an embryonic stage. And if you take a look at how that jaw connects in the embryonic stage of a mammal, it's very similar. Those bones are still attached, just like they are in reptiles. Now, I think at this point, I would be willing to give up all the evidence I've just given you in exchange for this single statement, which again is verifiable. Life on Earth shares a common genetic code. All organisms on Earth use DNA in some way to transmit information. That's why children tend to look like their parents. They get half of their genes and DNA from their mother and half from their father. This is true for plant cells like this one. There's the nucleus and there are chromosomes in there. And if you take a look at the chemical structure of that, we see that it always consists of these four bases paired in this way. Not only that, all organisms make the building blocks of cells in the exact same way. They use these things called ribosomes, and they take them in these triplets so that all organisms build proteins in the same way. The multi-billion-dollar biotechnology industry is built on this principle. That's why they can move genes from human beings, from other animals, into bacteria, and bacteria will translate those genes as if they were their own. And that's true even for the RNA viruses. The RNA viruses insinuate themselves in a cell and translate information in the exact same way. Now, there's nothing more exciting right now than molecular biology. Almost weekly, there are major breakthroughs in molecular biology and genetics. Here, for example, last week, molecular biologists identified the cystic fibrosis gene, which will be a major, major breakthrough and contribute to the health and happiness of a lot of people in this country. And they use several techniques that allow them to compare in detail the structure of the protein associated with the sweat gland. And they do this with a relatively simple technique. Not easy, but simple. Well, there are a lot of proteins thousands and thousands of different kinds of proteins, and some of them are enzymes. If we use this exact same material, we can compare proteins, specialized proteins called enzymes, in a large group of organisms. For example, we can compare humans to primates and find there's on the average one difference. Mammals to reptiles at 14.5 differences, amphibians 18.5, fish 22.5. We have the same functional enzyme. It is different in different organisms, and it is different in different organisms through relationship by common descent. Those same data are consistent with the independent age measurements and the independent strata shown here. I think that the sum of these data have at least convinced me that life on Earth is related by common descent. We want to now just take a minute to ask, if these principles of science led to this conclusion, what else have they done? Well, they deal with, as I said, the natural laws of the universe, testable hypotheses, empirical results should be reproducible by others. Now, if you lived in London in 1632, it was not a very pleasant place to live. This is a month, I think, a bill of mortality. There were 211 people born at that time, and 383 died. London would soon be vacant if it wasn't for all these people migrating in from the countryside. Why they would migrate in, given that mortality rate, I don't know. Maybe it was worse in the country. The point of this is that there are a lot of diseases on here, consumption, dropsy, fever, that resulted in staggering toll of death and misery. The reason they were given those names, and other names like King's Evil, is that at that time it was thought that diseases were largely controlled by supernatural powers. That is, the king had such power that he could turn on someone and make them ill and die just by looking at them. Or rising of the lights, particularly if women watched the sunrise, if they were pregnant, they would die. And then it was sort of expanded to a whole variety of things. We know now that these diseases, cholera, smallpox, yellow fever, polio, and measles, have a definite cause. And it's called the germ theory of disease. And we achieve that knowledge that increased the health and longevity of everyone in this room by applying those principles of scientific investigation along with the advice from Jesus of Nazareth when he said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God." And to mix religion and science, ladies and gentlemen, does a massive disservice to both. Thank you.
Dr. Gish.
Well, I want to say, first of all, that I appreciate this presentation by Dr. Abele. It is more or less the standard textbook story of evolution, and so we should certainly express our appreciation for his presentation. Of course, there's some very critical things that have been missed here and sort of glossed over, and we want to touch on some of those things which we feel are very, very important to the subject of origins. Let me, first of all, say what we are not debating about tonight. We're not going to debate the age of the earth. Now, I have some very different ideas from Dr. Abele concerning the age of the earth, but creation scientists and conservative Christian theologians and others differ on the age of the earth. Some maintain the earth is old, some maintain that the earth is young. So since there's a difference of opinion among the creationists themselves, there can hardly be an issue between creationists and evolutionists on this point. As we will see, it doesn't make any difference how old the universe is or how old the earth is. That's not nearly long enough. Now, secondly, of course, we're not here to debate the biblical record of creation. I'm very happy that Dr. Abele has stuck to science and has not diverted himself off into areas like that. We're not here to talk about theology. We are here to talk about the scientific evidence that relates to this subject of origins. Did the universe and its living organisms come into existence by some mechanistic, naturalistic, evolutionary process to which we can ascribe to properties inherent in matter? Or was the universe and its living inhabitants brought into being supernaturally, theistically, by processes which are not operating in the universe today? In other words, by a process of special creation. Now, I think we should very carefully define what we are talking about here tonight, creation and evolution, so we can more intelligently look at the evidence. And I'm going to describe creation and evolution only in general terms. Whether Dr. Abele believes in punctuated equilibrium, the hopeful monster mechanism, or Lamarckism, or the standard neo-Darwinian explanation, whatever, it all fits under the umbrella of evolution. And far as the creationists are concerned, whether they're young, believe in a recent creation, or old creation, or gap theory, or what, or even whether they're Hindus or Christians or what, if you believe in creation, a theistic creation, all of that will fit under this umbrella. Now, I think we ought to allow Huxley, Sir Julian Huxley, to define evolution for us. He was one of the world's leading evolutionists until he passed away, and so he should be authority on that subject. And now if we'll dim the light, thank you. Now, Sir Julian Huxley, this British biologist and evolutionist, defined evolution in this way. He says that evolution, in the extended sense, can be defined as a directional and essentially irreversible process occurring in time, which in its course gives rise to an increase of variety and an increasingly high level of organization in its products. Our present knowledge indeed forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation. End of quote. Now, first of all, we note that according to Huxley, evolution is a process of self-transformation. God is not necessary. God is not involved. By this definition, God is excluded from the process. It was a process of self-transformation. It occurred according to properties inherent in matter. Now, I'm not saying that all evolutionists are atheists. As a matter of fact, most are not. But the theory is an atheistic theory. It does not employ God. It does not use any outside intervention, any intelligence. Nothing like that is involved at all. It occurred by these random processes involved in evolution. Now, furthermore, notice that it is a directional process. We have gone from the disorder and the chaos of the Big Bang to the cosmos. We've gone from disorder to order. We've gone from the simplicity of hydrogen gas to the complexity of the human brain. And we can see that the human brain is indeed a very, very complex structure. The human brain has 12 billion brain cells, and since each brain cell is connected to 10,000 other brain cells, that means there's 120 trillion connections in the human brain. Now, where did this come from? Where did this human brain come from? Well, according to the theory of evolution, ultimately it came from hydrogen gas. Because you see, one of the more popular theories on the origin of the universe is called the Big Bang theory. According to this theory, some billions of years ago, all the matter and energy in the universe was crammed together in a huge cosmic egg. Now, nobody has the foggiest notion of where the cosmic egg came from or how it got there. Someone suggested perhaps the cosmic chicken laid the cosmic egg. And then you got a problem explaining where the cosmic chicken came from. But anyhow, there it was, and then for some equally inexplicable reason, this cosmic egg exploded. Now, what came out of that explosion, that Big Bang? Hydrogen gas, along with some helium. And that's all. There wasn't any carbon or oxygen or nitrogen or uranium or lead or anything like that. Hydrogen and a minor amount of helium, and these gases expanded out in the vast stretches of the universe. And that's all there was. That was the universe. And then supposedly, somehow, from this hydrogen gas, stars created themselves, and galaxies created themselves. Our solar system created itself. Life evolved on this planet. And that first microscopic form of life then evolved into everything else living today, including people. So according to this theory, we've gone from hydrogen gas to people. Someone has said if that's true, then we could say that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given enough time, becomes people. And of course, that's precisely what evolutionists believe. As a scientist, I find that notion to be absolutely incredible. I don't know how anyone could believe it, but that, you see, is what they believe, because obviously there was nothing but hydrogen gas then, and now there's people. And so we came from hydrogen gas. Now there was some time involved, of course, and intermediate, but that's where we could trace our ultimate ancestry, you might say, back to hydrogen gas. And now notice what Huxley said. Everything is a product of evolution. That means every living thing. It means our consciousness. It means our ability to remember the past, to plan for the future. Even our very faith in God is nothing more than a product of evolution, according to Huxley and leading evolutionists. And of course, we notice that it's gone from chaos to order. We've gone to higher and higher levels of organization, from hydrogen gas to the human brain. Now that's the general concept of evolution. Now that is what is being taught in most schools and practically every college and university, public college and university here in the United States. Now we contrast that to the concept of creation. We believe that God exists, that He is real. We certainly cannot exclude that possibility. If God exists, if God is real, then creation is not only logical and plausible, I think it's inevitable. Now, according to the creationists then, God, or some intelligent being, and whoever he was, he certainly was adequate for the job, he brought everything into being directly. He created the stars and the galaxies, he created our solar system, he created life on this planet, and he created each basic type of plant and animal. The separate and distinct kinds have always been separate and distinct. There has been no common descent from a common ancestor. We are not genetically related to apes or to onions or anything else on the face of this earth. We've been separate and distinct from the very beginning. And that's the two basic models of origins. Now, I would agree with Dr. Abele. Science does not invoke the supernatural. In my work in biochemistry, I never invoked the supernatural. Whatever I saw happening today, I believe must have happened in the past and would happen in the future. That's the only way a scientist can operate. We assume in our attempt to understand and explain the operation of the universe and the operation of living organisms that these things operate according to natural laws and processes. However, the evolutionist goes beyond that. He steps outside of the limits of empirical science. He says we must not only use those natural laws and processes to explain the operation of the universe and the operation of living organisms, but we must use those very same natural processes to explain the origin of the universe and the origin of life and the origin of all living organisms. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's where we part company. And that is not science. Because you see, that is, you can't, what I should say, you cannot construct a scientific theory about origins. Why? For the very reasons that Dr. Abele himself pointed out. Science deals with the observable and repeatable observable events. Dr. Abele wasn't there when the universe came into existence. I wasn't there. You weren't there. No, there were no human witnesses to the origin of the universe. There were no human witnesses to the origin of life. There were no human witnesses to the origin of a single living organism. Those events happened only once, and they happened in the unobservable past. And you cannot construct testable scientific theories about unique events. Creation and evolution are inferences based upon circumstantial evidence. Creation is absolutely just as scientific as creation, as evolution, and I believe more so. But they both rest on inferences. But there is evidence available. We do have evidence available. We can construct models. We can construct these inferences. Now, what evidence is available? Well, Dr. Abele has mentioned a few. The fossil record, and we'll come to that shortly. But we do have the natural laws and natural processes that are operating in the universe today. Now, according to Dr. Abele and the evolutionists, there must be no contradictions between the natural laws that are now operating and the theory of evolution. Quite obviously, there can be no contradictions if evolution is true. So we can compare then predictions of evolution based upon the theory and look at the natural laws and processes that are operating today. Now, first I want to look at the science of thermodynamics, which Dr. Abele has already mentioned. Now, there is a natural law called the second law of thermodynamics. Now, first of all, let me point out the fact that if evolution is true, if we've gone from hydrogen gas to people, if this has happened, then matter must have that tendency. Matter must have a natural tendency to organize itself. It must have a natural tendency to promote itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex, to higher and higher levels of organization. That must be true if evolution is true. On the other hand, if creation is true, we expect something very, very different. We would not expect that matter would have a natural tendency to promote itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex, to higher and higher levels of organization. However, if something has happened since creation to change the initial created state, the only thing that could happen would be matter would go downward. Matter might have a natural tendency to deteriorate, to decay, to run down, to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple, if creation is true. And so evolution says we've gone this way, and we are going this way, and we can go this way, and creation says no, the tendency is to go in the other direction. Well, let's take a look now at the real world. Let's go out there. Let's take a look. Let's see what's happening out there in this very real world. What we find, ladies and gentlemen, is that matter does not have a natural tendency to transform itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. We do not have a natural law that describes such a tendency. It's not been recognized by scientists. However, we have recognized a natural tendency to go precisely in the opposite direction. There is a universal natural tendency for all systems to go downward, to decay, to run down. From the scale of the galaxies down to the level of the molecules, we see this natural tendency. Fact is, this radiometric dating process could not even function without such a process going on. It's universal. It's so universal, it's been formalized as a natural law, the second law of thermodynamics. Now let us allow an evolutionist to define that law for us. Isaac Asimov, very virulent anti-creationist, and so he ought to be qualified to define that law that would satisfy evolutionists. We see that in this next slide. This is taken from the Smithsonian Institute Journal, June of 1970. Now, this is what Dr. Asimov had to say about the second law of thermodynamics. He says, quote, "Another way of stating the second law then is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly." Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again, very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing, and everything collapses, breaks down, wears out, and deteriorates all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about. End of quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it does seem to me, if that's what the second law of thermodynamics is all about, if that's one of the most well-established natural laws known to science, evolution is in trouble. We have a process going downward. We do not have a process going upward. The tendency is not to go in that direction. The tendency is to go downward. In fact, it's true of the entire universe. Every star in the universe is burning up its fuel. Now, the day will come, inevitably, if there is no God, or if God would not intervene, when this universe will die. Because, you see, the day will come, inevitably, when every star in the entire universe will have burned up all of its fuel. And then the lights will go out. And there'll be no more activity, there'll be no more life anywhere in this universe. Now, the universe will still be here, quite obviously, but it will be a dead universe. Now, this is a question I'd like to ask Dr. Abele, a question I've asked evolutionists time and time again, and a question for which I've never received a rational answer. And that is this: if the natural laws and natural processes which now govern the universe are leading inevitably to its death and destruction, and if those natural laws and processes are all there is and all there ever has been, how then did those very same natural laws and processes create the universe in the first place? Is it possible that the very same processes which are now destroying the universe could have been responsible for its origin? What sort of tortured logic would one have to use to reach such an impossible conclusion? Ladies and gentlemen, this universe could not have created itself. That's a physical impossibility. Now, there's absolutely no question that the second law of thermodynamics applies without exception to an isolated system. Now, an isolated system is a system on which no work is being performed from the outside. It's a system in which nothing is being brought in from the outside. In the evolutionary view, the universe is an isolated system. Now, the second law of thermodynamics says such a system will never, ever become more organized. It'll never become more complex. It'll never become more highly structured. But it will inevitably, with time, run down and deteriorate. And yet evolutionists persist in believing that this universe is an isolated system that started in this chaos and disorder of the Big Bang and a simplicity of hydrogen gas and transformed itself into the universe we have today, which is undeniably incredibly complex, containing millions of very complex organisms on this earth. Clearly, in violation of the second law of thermodynamics, this universe could not have created itself. Now, Dr. Abele has said, well, we got energy coming in from the sun, and that's certainly true. And therefore, you wouldn't have any problem with the second law of thermodynamics because the earth is not an isolated system. It's open to the energy from the sun. Ladies and gentlemen, that is no solution whatsoever to this problem. All systems, open or closed, tend to run down. No matter if you are getting energy from the outside, the tendency is to run down. Now, certain systems can build up in complexity. Automobile factories produce automobiles, and green plants can start with a seed and sprout into a great plant, and fertilized egg cells can develop into adult organisms. That's true. They're getting energy from the outside. But there is much more than that, already mentioned by Dr. Abele. What did he say utilized the energy from the sun? Green plants and living organisms. Now, if you have photosynthesis, or if you have this mechanism that can take that energy from the sun and transform it and convert it to a useful form, then it is possible to utilize that energy and to build up very complex things. But where did they come from in the first place? Where did photosynthesis come from before there was any photosynthesis? Where did these living organisms come from when there was no mechanism, no machinery? The energy from the sun, ladies and gentlemen, is terribly, terribly destructive, not constructive. The only reason life exists on the earth is because we have a layer of ozone around the earth which absorbs and filters out the ultraviolet light, allowing the visible light to penetrate, which can be utilized by green plants. on the hypothetical primordial Earth, you would have no oxygen, therefore you'd have no ozone. And so the ultraviolet light from the sun would come right down to the surface and destroy everything, kill everything. Life cannot exist in the presence of ultraviolet light. How then could it have evolved? No, to build up complexity, you've got to have that machinery, and you've got to have a control mechanism, and that was not existing on this earth to begin with. And in any case, it is absolutely certain the universe could not have created itself if science is science. The creation scientist says we must reject this irrational, unscientific notion that the universe created itself. It had to be created. It is not an isolated system, quite obviously. Now, what about some of these other factors? What about the vast complexity? I'm very happy that Dr. Abele showed the slide on the synthesis of protein. I don't know whether you caught that or not. Did you look at the incredibly complex mechanism required to synthesize the protein inside of living cells? Why, you have to have DNA, you have to have messenger RNA, you have to have transfer RNA, you've got to have ribosomal RNA, you've got to have a multitude of enzymes. It all has to be perfectly organized. And that just happened. Just accidentally, it put itself together. The second law of thermodynamics, ladies and gentlemen, said that's never going to happen. Let's look at something somewhat more simple. We look at a molecule. This is an enzyme, a protein enzyme. Now, you've got to have hundreds of enzymes to get life started. The simplest form of life would have to have hundreds of enzymes and would have to have hundreds of DNA and RNA molecules. Have to synthesize proteins, and Dr. Abele has already illustrated how incredibly complex that is. You've got to have a very complex apparatus to get life started. You have to have enzymes. Enzymes are catalysts which make chemical reactions go very rapidly, which ordinarily go slowly. And you have to have them to have life. Now, enzymes are proteins, and proteins are made up of amino acids. In protein today, we have 20 different kinds of amino acids. Now, on the hypothetical primordial Earth, if you had any amino acids, and I'm convinced you couldn't even have that, you'd have much more than just this 20, which would make the origin of life much more difficult. But let's make it easy for the evolutionists. Let's just assume there were these 20 amino acids that we find in protein today. Proteins, on the average, have 400 of these amino acids arranged in precise order. That is, on the average. A protein would have 400 amino acids. Some have 1,000, some have less than 100, but the average is around 400. This is an enzyme, ribonuclease, that has 124 amino acids. And because of the precise arrangement here, we have this enzyme. Just like we must arrange the letters of the alphabet in precise order to convey information, so these amino acids must be arranged in precise order to have an enzyme, or to have hemoglobin, or human growth hormone, or cytochrome, or something like that. Now, how did this happen? How did those amino acids get in that order? Well, just by chance. It just accidentally happened. Now, I would never convince you that that just accidentally happened. You could give a monkey a typewriter and let him type away for 5 billion years. There wouldn't be the remotest probability he'd type this message by chance with no spelling errors. Now, you wouldn't believe that. Well, now the evolutionists, however, would have us to believe that this just happened by chance, because before you have life, everything is depending on chance. Well, we can calculate the probability. Lysine is number 1, that's 1 chance out of 20. Then it's followed by glutamic acid. Well, the probability we have lysine followed by glutamic acid is 1 over 20 times 1 over 20, that's 1 out of 400. Then the first 3 amino acids, lysine, glutamic acid, threonine, that's 1 over 20 times itself 3 times, that's 1 chance out of 8,000. Then the first 4, 1 chance out of 160,000. The first 5, 1 chance out of 3,200,000. The first 6, 1 chance out of 64 million. And those 124, well, to calculate that, you've got to multiply 1 over 20 times itself 124 times. I don't think your computer could handle a number that big. That would never happen on this earth. You could make 1 trillion tries a second for 5 billion years, assembling 124 amino acids at random, and there wouldn't be the remotest probability that you'd arrange them in that order. Because the number of different ways you can arrange 124 amino acids, 20 different kinds, is so huge, the number of tries that you could make in that 5 billion years would be rather minuscule. Let me illustrate it with something more simple. If I ask 17 people to line up, and then to reassemble in a second way, in a third way, in a fourth way, how many times could 17 people line up without lining up twice in the same order? Just 17. Well, you're not going to believe me, because it's more than 355 trillion different ways. That is, if I wrote their name down on a piece of paper and they assembled themselves in a certain way, they'd have one chance out of 355 trillion of lining up the way I'd written down on this piece of paper. See, I told you weren't going to believe me. Well, you get 16 of your friends together after the meeting and you try. The universe will be gone before you finish. Put it into your computer. It's 17 times 16 times 15 times 14 times 13 down onto 1. It's more than 355 trillion. But that's only 17. What about 124? Not going to happen. Not on this earth. Not in 5 billion years. Dr. Abele said he had plenty of time. We can prove it. No, there isn't nearly enough time. And even if you did happen to get that particular arrangement by chance, what would you have? One single molecule of one single protein. But to get life started here on Earth with 350 million cubic miles of water, you've got to have billions of tons each of every protein molecule needed, billions of tons each of DNA and RNA molecules, which are much more complex, and you've got to have much more. That would never happen on this earth by any mechanistic, naturalistic process. And even if you had all of that, you wouldn't get a living cell, ladies and gentlemen, because a living cell is not a bag of protein. A living cell has very complex membrane. It has the energy factories, the protein factories, the genetic material, all of that very complex machinery that Dr. Abele was talking about. And it all has to be put together precisely, just like the mechanism of your watch. Is that going to happen? Are those molecules swimming around in the ocean going to say to one another, hey fellas, we're not really doing anything useful, just meandering around. Now let's get together. Let's start cooperating. Let's construct some complex system. Let's do something meaningful. No. What's going to happen to those molecules? If they were there, they would deteriorate very rapidly, I assure you. As a biochemist, those things are very, very unstable, and they would deteriorate very rapidly if you had them. They would never, ever organize themselves into a living cell. Here's an article, newspaper article that appeared in a London newspaper, August 4th, 1981, in the Daily Express. Two skeptical scientists put their heads together and reach an amazing conclusion. There must be a God. Not such an amazing conclusion, perhaps, to some of us, but it was to these two scientists, because when they began this study, they were both atheists. One of these scientists was Sir Fred Hoyle, famous British astronomer, one of the world's foremost astronomers, and his friend Chandra Wickramasinghe, professor and chairman of the Department of Applied Mathematics and Astronomy, University College, Cardiff, Wales. Now, what these two scientists did, they became interested in the problem of the origin of life some years ago, and they made certain assumptions about the minimum requirement to get life started. And then they calculated the probability of that happening on this earth by some natural, mechanistic, evolutionary process. The probability, one chance out of 10 to the 40,000th power. That's one chance out of the number 1, followed by 40,000 zeros. Ladies and gentlemen, let me assure you, that is flatly zero. And so they assumed that life did not evolve on this planet. But they said, after all, we have 100 billion galaxies. There's 100 billion stars in each galaxy. Now let us assume that every star in the universe has a planet like the Earth. Let us assume that the universe is 20 billion years old. Now let us calculate the probability that life has evolved somewhere in the universe in that 20 billion years. The answer came back, forget about it. The probability was so low, it was essentially nil. Sir Fred Hoyle has declared that the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Now, ladies and gentlemen, even though some of these things fall out of the sky, I don't believe that. And, you know, now, they said, obviously, evolution is impossible. They said it is not physically possible that life could have evolved anywhere in the universe. Therefore, since it could not have created itself naturally, it had to be created supernaturally. Therefore, there must be a God. Neither one of these scientists believe the Bible or the book of Genesis. But they do believe that wherever life exists, it had to be created. Therefore, there must be a God. Powerful, positive evidence for creation. Now, let's look at the world of the past. We've been looking at the present world. We've been trying to decide, is evolution a reasonable theory? Could it really have taken place? Is it possible, looking at the natural laws and processes and chemical thermodynamics and so forth, is it possible that this universe could have put itself together? Is it possible that life could have evolved? But now let's go to the next step. It is assumed by evolutionists that life originated on this planet about 3.5 billion years ago. I don't agree with any of that, but this is what they assume. And Dr. Abele has shown some slides of microscopic fossils, that is, of these microfossils, little single-celled, microscopic, soft-bodied bacteria and algae that we now have many, many reports of these things in the scientific literature. Now, it is assumed by evolutionists that this microscopic single-cell organism evolved into multicellular organisms which diversified into the great array of very complex invertebrates that we have on this planet. And then these complicated invertebrates evolved into fishes, and then fishes evolved into amphibians, amphibians to reptiles, reptiles to mammals and birds, right on up to man. Now, if that is true, if that really did happen, and it took place hundreds of millions of years of time, then the fossil record should produce an enormous number of transitional form or intermediate type. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is the critically important evidence for evolution. That is the evidence we must have if evolution is true. Not that invertebrates come before fishes and fishes come before amphibians. That doesn't prove anything. We know the buggy came before the Model T. We know the Model T Ford came before the Model A Ford. We know that, but we also know that the buggy did not evolve into a Model T Ford, and the Model T Ford did not evolve into a Model A Ford. They were all created by intelligent creators. Now, what we have to find, if evolution is true, is the presence of these transitional forms showing a microscopic organism evolving into these very complicated invertebrates, some invertebrate evolving into a fish, the fins of a fish gradually changing into the feet and legs of the amphibian, amphibians to reptiles and so forth, scales changing into feathers, forelimbs into wings, and apes into people. That's what we must find if evolution is true. On the other hand, if creation is true, and by the way, we have plenty of fossils. Do you know there's 250,000 different fossil species in our museum today? 250,000 different fossil species, enormous fossil record, tremendous sampling of the fossil record. If evolution is true, tens of thousands of those fossils must be of undoubted transitional forms or intermediate type. On the other hand, if creation is true, we would not expect to find intermediate forms. We'd expect each basic type to appear fully formed right at the start with no transitional form. There would be no link. There is no continuum. There is no descent from earlier organisms you see. In other words, cats have always been cats. Dogs have always been dogs. Tigers have always been tigers. Onions have always been onions. Apes have always been apes, and people have always been people. There are no links, no connections. Variation within limits, of course. Varieties of finches, various races of people, many varieties of dogs, yes, but always limited within the circumscribed boundaries of each created kind. You can't cross a dog with a cat and get a dat. That just doesn't happen. And neither is there any evidence that anything like that has happened, that there's been a common descent of cats and dogs from a common ancestor. Let's look at this fossil record. Here on this slide, we see a reconstruction of animals whose fossils are found in Cambrian rocks. Now, evolutionists believe that Cambrian rocks began to form 600 million years ago. And if you take all of the Cambrian rocks on the face of the earth and total it all up, they maintain it would take 80 million years for those rocks to form. Take the present rate of deposition of sediment, total it all up, it'd take about 80 million years for those rocks to form. And so they say we have the Cambrian period, beginning 600 million years ago and going to 520 million years ago. Well, now let me say, first of all, I just don't have the foggiest notion how you get fossils under those conditions. No animal, when it dies, is going to lie around on the ground or float around the water for years and years as this sediment slowly settles out and covers that creature and makes a fossil out of it. You just don't get fossils that way. The only way you can get a fossil is a creature has to be buried, and buried very quickly, to protect it from scavengers and from oxidation and from bacterial decomposition and chemical decomposition. Then and only then do you get fossils. Here we have billions times billions of fossils, and enormous fossils, millions, tens of hundreds of millions of fossil fishes, and enormous fossil graveyards. We have nothing like that forming today anywhere on the face of this earth. I maintain that fossil record had to be produced catastrophically and by an enormous catastrophe produce what we have. But regardless, whenever they formed or however, there they are. And we have fossils of the sea urchins and trilobites, and we have fossils of the sponges and the jellyfish, the swimming crustacean, and these sea lilies and clams and snails and brachiopods and worms, very complicated invertebrates. Evolutionists believe their origin took hundreds of millions of years of time. Now, if that is true, then in the pre-Cambrian rocks, the rocks which generally underlie the Cambrian rocks, in those pre-Cambrian rocks, we've got to find the evolutionary ancestors of these animals, quite obviously. Many of those pre-Cambrian rocks are undisturbed, perfectly suitable for the preservation of fossils. If the fossils were there, they certainly would be found. And they've got to be there if evolution is true. We have this great diversity of complicated invertebrates, supposedly having evolved during hundreds of millions of years of time. What do we find, ladies and gentlemen? Not one single fossil of an ancestor for one of these organisms has ever been found. We do not have ancestors for jellyfish. We do not have ancestors for trilobites. We do not have ancestors for sponges or worms or brachiopods or any of these other things, clams and snails and things like that. Every one of these organisms appears fully formed right at the start. There are some alleged soft-bodied fossils found supposedly before the Cambrian, called the Ediacaran fauna. Scientists have discovered that they are very, very different from the Cambrian animals. They could not possibly be the ancestors of Cambrian animals. All of these animals appear fully formed right at the start without a trace of an ancestor. Ladies and gentlemen, that settles the question. Evolution is dead in the water. You see, evolution cannot be true. You just cannot have evolution of this tremendous array of very complicated invertebrates, have hundreds of millions of years of evolution, billions times billions of these things are found. We ought to find billions times billions of their fossil ancestors. We've never found one. Now, evolution can speculate, as Dr. Abele has done, what may have become a vertebrate, and he referred to some living organism. But ladies and gentlemen, there's not a shred of evidence in the fossil record that this is true, that anything has evolved into these things or into a fish. It is supposed by evolutionists that one of these invertebrates evolved into a fish. Now that's a remarkable transformation. Invertebrate evolves into a vertebrate. Vertebrate fishes have internal skeletons. Now, ladies and gentlemen, during 100 million years, billions times billions of the transitional forms would have lived and died. And our museum should have millions upon millions upon millions of fossils of these transitional forms showing some invertebrate gradually becoming converted into a vertebrate, into a fish. That's got to be true if evolution is true. Ladies and gentlemen, nobody has found even one. Not even one single fossil of a transitional form between an invertebrate and a vertebrate. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about, jawless, jawed, cartilaginous, bony, whatever, it doesn't make any difference. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about has appeared on this planet fully formed, without a trace of an ancestor. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I say evolution is dead in the water. There's no use continuing the discussion. It is quite obvious that evolution has not taken place. We are vertebrates. Therefore, supposedly, we evolved from fishes. They have no ancestors. Obviously, then, we have no ancestors. The evidence is very, very clear on that, ladies and gentlemen. And there's no argument, there's no discussion, there's no quarrel about this. Evolutionists readily concede that this is true, but they believe in evolution anyhow. You see, evolution is basically a worldview. It's how you look at things. And fundamentally, then it becomes a religion. And it really doesn't make any difference what the evidence is. You see, you still believe it. Now, listen, ladies and gentlemen, this cannot be true. I have challenged evolutionists time and time again. Please explain how you could have 100 million years of evolution of an invertebrate into a fish and not even be able to find one single transitional form. And nobody has even responded, let alone explained. Now, there is much more, of course, because we have much more evidence. Flight is a remarkable test case for creation versus evolution. Non-flying creatures had to become flying creatures. Flying insects, birds, flying reptiles, and the bats, flying mammals, supposedly evolved. So we have multiplied opportunities to find transitional form. Well, here we have a fossil dragonfly, supposedly 380 million years old. What is he? He's a dragonfly. And they're dragonflies immediately. We have not one single transitional form between a non-flying insect and flying insect. We have many fossils of non-flying insects. They claim they found fossils of mites and spiders and daddy long legs and silverfish and things like that are supposed to be more than 350 million years old. And they said it just looked like they died yesterday. They were so perfectly preserved. I think yesterday is a little closer to the truth than 350 million years. But regardless, there they are, and they are complete at the very start. And there's not one single transitional form ever has been found between a non-flying insect and a flying insect, not one. And many fossils of each have been found. Then we have the flying reptiles. We see here this pteranodon. Pteranodon had a long toothless beak. He had, notice, the long fourth finger. All flying reptiles had very long fourth fingers supporting the wing membrane. Now, according to evolution then, we had an ordinary reptile, and it was doing very, very nicely. And then it had a mutation, made its fingers get just a wee bit longer. And then for some strange unknown reason that conferred survival value, so in the struggle for existence, it replaced the original, eliminated the original. Then we had another happy accident after another 100 or 1,000 or thousands of years and a lot of bad mutation. Finally had another good mutation, fingers got just a wee bit longer again, struggle for existence, replaced the original. And after thousands of these mutations, the finger got longer and longer and longer and longer. And would you believe it, at the same time, somehow, other genetic accidents created the wing membrane, the flight muscles, the hollow bones, and converted the jaws and teeth to a long toothless beak. Now, first of all, Can you imagine this creature about 25% along the way? He's got 25% wings. He can't fly, obviously, but he can't run any longer either. He's a very awkward creature. And he's going to get eliminated, of course. Once you have that flying reptile, he'd do very nicely. But nothing works until everything works, you see. Now, furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we've never found a single trace of a transitional form. Not a trace. All of these flying reptiles appear fully formed. And that is powerful, positive evidence for creation. Same is true of the bats. Here is a picture of what is supposed to be the world's oldest known bat, taken from the cover page of Science, December 9, 1966. Dr. Glenn Jepson, the man who studied this fossil, said that those fossilized bones were found in rocks 50 million years old. He said nothing related to a bat has ever been found that's older than that. All right. Then, according to evolutionists, here you have the world's oldest bat. There's the fossilized bones, and there's what the bat must have looked like. There he is, the world's oldest known bat. What is he? 100% bat. He has all the essential features of the modern bat, including the sonar system found in many modern bats. He appears fully formed, not a trace of an ancestor, not a trace of a transitional form, and essentially no change since he appeared on this planet, supposedly 50 million years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, is that evolution? Is that the evidence required by evolution? Absolutely not. But it is powerful, positive evidence for creation. And then we have Archaeopteryx. Evolutionists just love to talk about Archaeopteryx. Now, of course, if evolution is true, there should be tens of thousands of undoubted transitional forms. But evolutionists almost always talk about Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx was a bird, supposedly existed on this planet 150 million years ago. Now, Archaeopteryx was not just a feathered reptile. I've never seen a reptile that you could just stick a bunch of feathers in it and kick it in the tail and it'd fly. Archaeopteryx had the basic form and pattern of the avian wing. It had feathers identical to the feathers of modern birds. And ladies and gentlemen, feathers are totally different structure than scales. Scales are flat, horny sheath. A feather is in very complicated structure. It has a central shaft, then it has barbs, then barbules and hooks on the barbules, so it is just marvelously constructed, and it's designed for aerodynamic function. Furthermore, its mode of development is totally different than that from a scale. A feather develops from a follicle, just like the hairs on your head, and the mode of development is very, very complicated. This bird had perfect feathers, the same kind of feathers found on flying birds. It had perching feet. It had a bird-like skull. They used to say that the skull was reptile-like until they dug it out of the limestone and studied it. Turned out to be bird-like. It had a furcula, or wishbone. The talus, the ankle area, was bird-like. The pubis was bird-like. It was bird. And there are no intermediate forms between this bird and a reptile, or between this bird and any other bird. Now, it did have teeth, had claws on the wings, and a long tail, and these are some of the characteristics. Supposed to link it to a reptile. Well, maybe, but maybe not. It's true that modern birds don't have teeth, but it's also true that in the fossil record, some birds had teeth and some didn't. That's not surprising. Some fishes have teeth and some don't. Some amphibians have teeth, some don't. Some reptiles have teeth, some don't. Most mammals have teeth, some don't. And I suppose most of us have teeth and some don't. But that does not necessarily say anything about our ultimate ancestor. But what about the claws on the wings? Well, it just so happens there are several birds living today that have claws on the wing. The Hoatzin of South America, the Turako of Africa, and the ostrich has 3 very nice claws on its wings. But no one would claim for a moment that they're intermediate form. They're very much alive and well today. Now, furthermore, just recently, some scientists from Texas Tech University have discovered fossils of a bird in Texas that they say is 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. Now, if that's the case, it should be practically a reptile. But it turned out, if anything, it is more bird-like than Archaeopteryx. It has a very substantial bony keel, it has hollow bones, and some characteristic which would be characterized as even being more bird-like than Archaeopteryx. Just precisely the opposite predicted by evolutionists. Predictions, oh yes, but they fail time and time again. on a scale of 1 to 10, as far as flight is concerned, we'd have to give it to the creationists, about 9.9 or 9.99. Now, finally, about the origin of man, evolutionists believe that something like this must have taken place. Some hypothetical common ancestor, they still haven't found him, but they suppose that he existed some millions of years ago, and they looked for fossils of these supposed transitional forms. From time to time, they believe they perhaps have had some evidence for something like this. These are fossils of a creature called Australopithecus. This is a skull found by Dr. Louis Leakey and his wife Mary in East Africa in 1959, and you can see it's very grossly ape-like. And there's the skull of Lucy. Donald Johanson found a series of these things in Ethiopia. One was of a female, about 40% complete. And although he said Lucy, as he called her, had the jaws, the teeth, the face, and brain of an ape, fact is, they said when they reconstructed the skull, it looked like a small female gorilla. Nevertheless, these creatures walked upright, just like you and me. Therefore, they must have been on their way to becoming people. That is what I'm sure is taught at Florida State University. It's taught at most major universities. It's in the textbooks. You see it in National Geographic, and it is a consensus of evolutionists. But there are some scientists who disagree with this analysis. These scientists are not creationists. Lord Zuckerman, a very famous British anatomist, Dr. Charles Oxnard, professor at University of Southern California, professor of anatomy, they have studied these fossils for many, many years, utilizing scientific teams, utilizing the most sophisticated methods of analysis. And they studied fossils of these creatures supposedly 1 to 2 million years younger than Lucy, therefore more recent in time than Lucy. If anything, they should be more man-like, more advanced. These scientists have declared that these creatures did not walk upright. They are not intermediate between ape and man, and they certainly are not our ancestors. That is a minority opinion, but these are the scientists that have done the very best research. And they are not creationists. They have no inclination to try to support creation. But that is the considered judgment of these scientists. And I think that is the very best science has been done on these creatures, and Lucy and her fellow creatures are going to get kicked out of the family tree of man. It may take a few years yet, just as has happened in the past, has happened with Piltdown Man. Here's a 1937 issue, Piltdown Man. And Piltdown Man turned out to be a hoax based upon an ape's jaw and a human skull that somebody had doctored up, put in the gravel pit, and fooled the world's greatest authorities for nearly 50 years, until the fraud was exposed by a chemist. And then we have Nebraska Man. A single tooth was found in western Nebraska in 1922. Very exciting discovery to evolutionists at that time, because they thought that it had some characteristics intermediate between ape and man, and they couldn't quite decide whether it was an ape like man or man like ape. And the Illustrated London News in 1922 published a picture of Nebraska Man, as he was called, based upon the descriptions of the scientists. We see that in this slide. Here's Nebraska Man, there's his wife, there's the tools that they were using, all based upon that one single tooth. Isn't science a fascinating subject? Well, a few years later, they discovered some additional remains of that creature. He turned out to be neither an ape-like man or a man-like ape. It turned out to be a pig. That's right. It was nothing more than a pig's tooth. Now, pardon me, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes I say this may be the case where an evolutionist made a man out of a pig. The pig made a monkey out of the evolutionist. But you see, these were good scientists, and they were careful scientists, but they were seeing something that was not there because they had expected to see it and because they had wanted to see it, you see. And then we have the Neanderthal people. Neanderthal people for 100 years were viewed as these very primitive people, subhuman people, Homo neanderthalensis. Well, it turned out that they were Homo sapien, just like you and me. But they suffered from arthritis. They suffered from rickets, a vitamin D deficiency, which causes bones to become soft and deformed. So they had some of these so-called primitive features. But now, recognizing that fact, this is a modern-day version of Neanderthal man. He has been upgraded to Homo sapien. A couple of scientists about 30 years ago, published an article about the Neanderthal people and said, now really, if you just take Neanderthal man and give him a shave and a haircut and a bath and put him in a business suit and place him on the New York subway, probably no one would take a second look. Well, that was 30 years ago. Of course, today you wouldn't have to give him a shave or a haircut, would you? Some circles in San Diego, you wouldn't even have to give him a bath and he'd do very nicely. But you see, he was not our subhuman ancestor. He was man. Piltdown man was not our ancestor, just a combination of an ape's jaw and a human skull. Nebraska man was not our ancestor, just a pig's tooth. And Ramapithecus turns out not to be our ancestor, turns out to be an orangutan. And so it goes on and on and on. Lord Zuckerman, not a creationist, in a book he published in 1964, said that if we exclude the possibility of creation, obviously man must have evolved from an ape-like creature. But if he did, there is absolutely no trace in the fossil record. And I would agree with that. We were not created in the image of an ape. We did not evolve from an ape. Man has always been separate and distinct. Now, in the 3 minutes left, I'd want to describe a process which I have challenged evolutionists to explain on the basis of any theory of evolution they can conceive. And that's the metamorphosis of a butterfly. Here's a monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly lays eggs. We see the developing egg here. And when it hatches, we have a caterpillar. The caterpillar main function in life is to chew leaves, eat leaves, and we see that it chewed a hole in the leaf, and it goes through several molts. Here's the final stage of the caterpillar. Now, according to evolutionists, I guess, it got an urge to hang glide or something. It wanted to get out into the air. It saw all these creatures flying around, looked like a wonderful way of life, and its life was very, very dull, just crawling around and eating leaves. And so it wants to fly, but it realized there's nothing about a caterpillar that would recommend it to become a butterfly or something like that. So it had a brilliant idea. We see that it fastens itself to a leaf, makes one last molt, and there it forms the chrysalis. And now it's just a mass of jelly. You see, it decided it's got to go right back down to ground zero and start all over again. But now it's got a big problem. How do you program a mass of jelly to become a butterfly? How would evolution do that? How would evolution start with a caterpillar and gradually, through a series of genetic mistakes or mutations, gradually change a caterpillar into a butterfly? Could it change the legs one at a time, part of a wing or something like that? It's got to change the mouth part for chewing leaves into the proboscis of the caterpillar, of the butterfly for sucking nectar. How could it do that? How could genetic mistakes, step by step, convert one into the other? There's no way any sort of evolutionary process could accomplish that. But we do see the developing butterfly, and it emerges from the chrysalis. And now it's pumping fluid from its fat tummy into its wings. The wings stiffen out and dry, and then we have the butterfly. Ladies and gentlemen, how did that happen by evolution? That is not possible. It was created by the master engineer, the master creator. I say, based upon all of the available scientific evidence that we have, the best scientific statement that we can make about our origins is still, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
As I indicated at the very beginning, we will now have a 10-minute break so that you can stretch, jot down a few questions on some cards, and then please turn in those cards to me, and then we will begin with the rebuttal speeches in about 10 minutes.